What up guys, Otterpop here, and today I'm going to be giving a little bit of commentary for a painting that I painted and recorded myself, so basically commentary for a speed paint that I have dubbed Mountain Sky. First thing you'll notice is that, first off, I'm using my pencil to do some basic outlining, but the lighting is going to change a couple times over the course of this video, which I do kind of apologize for. It was kind of tricky getting the right lighting, but yeah, so let's go ahead and just get started with some commentary. So yes, I'm starting with some lines, and I'll actually pop a little image in the bottom left corner, actually the upper right corner, let's do that instead, the upper right corner. So yes, I'm using some white paint now, but I'm going to pop the image in the upper left corner to give you an idea, to basically let you guys know exactly what kind of scene I'm going to be painting. And again, the colors are going to look a slight bit different. And the end result overall does look different, you know, regardless of whether this camera could pick it up or not. But I was starting with some white paint rather, for the sky because again, the sky wasn't like, you know, it wasn't like a dark blue or anything. I literally just use a very small touch of blue alongside some white paint to give it that sort of light feeling. So the paint looks a bit weird as I'm mixing it. I later realized that the paint was no longer very good, and I actually replaced it relatively recently, but the paint at that time, the white paint specifically, the other paint was fine, but the white paint in particular just wasn't good anymore. I had to toss it, so I've got new white paint. But yeah, now I'm in this instance, I'm trying to blend things together, which again isn't exactly turning out totally well, again because of the white paint. But I'm also at the same point trying to get the right color blue, while also, you know, mixing it relatively well. And of course, I added a little white paint because I thought, oh hey, I probably need to add a little bit more white paint. No, it was the problem with the paint itself. But good try. That is okay. Good try. Past me from a little while ago. And I do the same thing with the mountains. So I mean, I got the sky, but then I got the two sections below it, which are basically just different sections of mountains at a different distance. Obviously, the bottom section is the closest, and the middle section is the farthest, hence why I'm adding quite a bit of black, because not only is it farther, but I was trying to give it more of a general gray kind of hue, I guess you could say. It's not going to be what the final result looks like, obviously, but there was a little bit more of like a sort of gray coloration in that, than, you know, than the closer section that's in the bottom of the painting at the moment. But I'm adding a lot of blue right now, and yes, you may be like, but there's mountains, that means they're probably like, you know, got all kinds of trees on them, and you'd probably be right, or you may not have even thought that at all. And you'll notice that I also use a little bit of orange in that instance, and I actually pointed out in my last speed paint commentary that in order to darken a color, such as darkening blue while also giving it that same level of saturation, you want to use its complement, in this case orange, hence why I used just a little bit of orange to darken it, so that it still had, you know, a strong blue color about it, but was, you know, because again, a color like black, which is what I just used in this instance, would just kind of darken it, but would kind of take away some of that blue coloration, whereas the orange would darken it, but it would keep some of that coloration. So I did add a bunch of black, and I had a little bit of white to, again, give it a little bit more of like a sort of grayish, I'm already forgetting the word. It's not coloration, but I don't want to have to say that word over and over and over again, but it's not really hue either. Sort of that gray level, I guess you could say. Because again, it's almost like a sort of blue, like a dark bluish greenish gray that I was kind of going for, which I think in the end I managed to hit relatively well. But again, it was a little bit of a process trying to figure out, again, especially with the white, which wasn't good. I'm sorry, I really should stop saying that. So here is where I'm starting to get a little bit more particular about the you know, the outline of at least the top section of, you know, the middle part. And again, I do apologize for the light constantly changing. So now is where I'm starting on the bottom section, and I actually start with a crap ton of green this time. It's a little bit difficult to see because, again, I do kind of apologize for the lighting. It wasn't totally intended to look that way, but it was kind of the best that I worked with, and I did change Oh yeah, and here's where I kind of flipped it upside down so I could work on the side of the canvas rather, which is what I usually like to do with paintings. I don't know if some people like to, yeah, like this instance, I basically changed the video camera, or at least, you know, how it was recording. So it might be a little bit tricky to see, but I actually added some red spots everywhere up on the top section, because like I said earlier about complements, orange can darken blue and vice versa, and to darken green with it still keeping that same green coloration, I just need to add a little bit of red. But of course you can also see that I'm adding a little bit of black as well, because, you know, I mean, I could have added a little bit more red, but I intentionally wanted it to be just a little bit on the darker side. Or like, you know, have like a little bit more of that grayish green coloration. And of course, you know, I could just flip it around at this point, but I was waiting for the green and the black to dry. So all I could do right now is just, we'll darken the green a little bit more for one thing, but also kind of work on the middle section just to slipe it. There was actually an instance, I can't remember exactly when it was, where I actually had to wait about like half an hour, give or take, before I could flip it back over. But now I'm adding a little bit of white. Again, actually thinking about this in this exact moment, I'm not entirely sure why I added that white exactly. I was probably trying to give it a little bit more of a lighter feel. Actually, most likely because I wasn't getting the color that I quite wanted. And again, I think a big part of, you know, me not getting the color I wanted stemmed from me having a bad white to begin with. I apologize. I've been talking about, you know, having a bad white so much. But now I'm going to be adding a little bit of blue. I might be catching a little bit of like the black green color from the bottom, because the bottom part, well, in this case technically the top part, but the bottom section might still be a bit wet, so I might be catching just a slight bit of the greenish black. Not that that's entirely a bad thing, because I mean I did want the middle section to be a little bit more blue than the bottom section, but I also still wanted it to be just a slight bit green as well, because I mean in the image it does appear a bit more blue, but I still wanted to give it just a slight bit of green, so, or maybe not real, that's not what I intended to do, but it's kind of what I ended up doing. So again, I think I waited a little bit before I flipped it back over, and I believe in this instance, I wish I could see it a little bit better, I do apologize, but if I recall correctly, I'm using some lighter greens to either lighter greens or blacks. I might actually be using blacks. It's actually kind of hard to tell in this instance, but this is probably the instance where I'm starting to work on the trees, or at least a few of the trees. Okay, yeah, so it looks like I'm using a lighter green to work on some trees. I can't exactly remember which green it is, because I think it was just like a standard Artist Loft green that I used for the bottom section, but then I used, a little bit of a, it wasn't a phthalo green. That's the main green that I used initially, and then just darkened it with some red and black. But now I'm using a different green, like something a little bit like apple green. It's either apple green or something relatively similar, but either way, it is lighter than the phthalo green, hence why I kind of used it for some of the trees in the bottom section. Man, I cannot believe that. Well, I wish I would have positioned my camera somewhat differently, but it's really hard to position a camera to, you know, record you doing a speed paint. Yeah, no, it's actually pretty hard to do that. I might need to work in the future on trying to figure out how I would position the camera at an appropriate height and distance without really catching me, because it's not really about catching me, it's just about catching what's happening in the painting overall. Well, and of course, at this point, I hadn't quite figured out the, how, like, you know, the hue and the saturation and the white balance worked for the camera. Like, I hadn't totally messed with that kind of stuff yet, so that's why the color looks a bit funky and why it looks a little bit dark in the bottom. I think I changed the overall recording features, like, you know, hue, saturation, brightness, stuff like that. I think I changed those settings overall, like, at least 3 times over the course of this video. Yeah, that sounds about right, at least 3 times. It's a little bit tricky to tell what I'm doing right now. I might be using some kind of like black. Okay, so here, yep, here's the best example. Okay, so I see what I was doing now. So I was doing some of the trees in the bottom, but then I was also providing some of the black in some areas for like shading effects to give a good idea of what some of the hills may look like. So I was actually in this instance using a dry brush to create like clouds in the sky. But again, I was using the bad white paint, so it didn't really turn out very well. It was actually unsuccessful for a little while, and I was a little bit dissatisfied with that. I mean, it looked okay so far, but eventually I did switch to a newer, smaller tube of white that I had. So at this point, I think I just kind of semi-gave up or something like that, because I'm starting to blend the white at this point, but it's not really technically blending or anything like that. It's just kind of being spread across the layer of blue and white paint for the sky at this point. So yeah, as you can tell by the lighting is definitely very different. You can see a little bit more clearly the blue-gray tones of... Yeah, okay, so I know for a fact that I'm still using the bad white, but I was trying to make snow, or some of the snow that is, that is seen in the picture. But it's a little bit more obvious to see like the bluish-gray tones of the mountains that are in the background, and then to also see the dark green / like, blackish green, or I suppose, it would kind of be blackish green, I guess you could say. That kind of, represents the shade and the foothills, or clouds, but shadows in general to give you a good idea of what the general setting looks like. So yeah, seriously, I know for a fact that I'm still using the bad white, because that kind of effect, where it's just kind of, it's not just like, swishing my hand and just kind of painting, more like dabbing to create a sort of like almost semi-3D effect, I think is actually what I initially thought would be cool, what I was kind of going for, but it did not turn out quite the same way, because again, still the bad white paint. I think it was when I applied when I started applying a sort of second layer of white, because I think I put in all the white from the bad paint onto the mountains to create a snow-like effect initially, but then I switched to the newer white, to the smaller tube of white for the second layer, and it ended up looking much better. Like you could easily tell the difference between how they looked and how they dried too. The bad paint dried kind of fast, and it didn't look good. It looked extremely faded, almost translucent. No, that's not the word I'm looking for. Opalescent. Like, by the time the bad white paint had dried, it looked almost opalescent, almost like there was just a very, you could almost barely notice that it was there in the first place. That's kind of how bad it was. But I think I ended up waiting a little while for the initial bad white paint to dry. I'm just going to say bad white. That's probably what I'm just going to end up saying at this point. But I ended up waiting for that to dry for a little while. If that is the case, it'd be obvious in the video. But because I'm so anal retentive, I was being very particular about how I how I painted in the snow effects that were kind of not really the same, but similar enough as in the picture. I'm super anal retentive about stuff like that, especially when I feel like it could make it look even better, I guess you could say, in that sense. Gosh, I think I was actually working on this snow in the mountains for quite a while. I'm actually not sure how long, because I kind of find it best to sort of speed this video up and then just record myself watching this video and then add some audio to it, because I don't know, that just kind of made the most sense to me. I can start seeing it with some of the earliest white that I put in, how it's starting to dry and how it's starting to fade just a slight bit. It's not super noticeable, but it is something that is semi-noticeable at the moment. And again, there are some times where I just keep adding more white because I think that's the problem, but I think even I knew at that point that it was just the paint itself that just wasn't good anymore. It wasn't useful anymore. Again, it took me a while to figure out, but either it took me forever to figure out, or... What the heck? Oh, there were some noises outside. That was weird. Either it took me a while to figure out, or I was just kind of trying to ignore the fact that it was because of that. I'm not entirely sure which it was, because I mean this was from a little bit ago. How much longer am I going to be working on the snow? That's kind of the thing that it's almost like I'm reacting to a video and providing my commentary on it. That's basically what this is, because again, all I'm doing is just, I literally took the entire video that I had, which was, I want to say at least, it was about like 2 hours, 50 minutes in total, not including the pauses though. Some of those pauses of which could be upwards of 30 minutes. But I like recorded that, I smushed it all together into a sped up version, and I'm basically watching that video right now at this moment and just recording my audio for the commentary. Because again, I feel like that just kind of makes the most sense in at least in terms of providing commentary, or providing commentary with a speed paint. If it was a regular paint and not a speed paint, honestly, it would be a lot more boring. So yeah. Oh, I think I've already noticed I've started adding a little bit of white to certain areas of the upper tier of the green area. Okay, so now I'm using a completely different brush, and now all I'm doing is just adding a whole bunch of like sort of black lines to indicate, you know, trees and stuff. It's not supposed to be exact. Okay, I see the pause. I see I see the moment where I probably waited for a little bit. Okay, here it is. Here it is. This is where I started using, you can already immediately tell. This is where I started using the new smaller tube of white paint that I had on hand. Again, you can immediately tell. You can tell by just how it looks. And you can also tell, like I was saying earlier, like all the white that I initially put on there has dried so much that you can only see it kind of faintly. Like, almost like I didn't even really... Almost like I just kind of, you know, gently put a bunch of white paint on there. Not that I put a bunch of, you know, crappy white paint. But no, you can immediately tell, based on how the paint is all clumping, that, you know, it's and I wouldn't necessarily say better quality. Well, I mean, maybe kind of, because it was newer paint I hadn't used very often beforehand. But it is definitely, you know, paint that will stick on longer and will have a better effect, I guess you could say. I mean, that's probably not the best way to say it necessarily. But you know, once I figured that out, I remember feeling significantly happier that I had figured out that it was just the older paint all along was the issue. But I was happy with how much better it looked, and how it kind of, again, gathered together the way it did. And again, I wasn't really like, you know, swishing across the canvas or anything. I was, for the most part, just kind of like, you know, dabbing, which I thought would create a much nicer effect. And then with this instance, I am taking some of that paint and kind of, you know, spreading it to some areas around the bigger clumps of paint. And I think I do something a little bit similar with this segment right here, where in, like, you know, the top tier of the green forested area, I'm kind of doing something a little bit similar, where I'm, like, you know, dabbing, but then spreading some of the outer edges of those areas. And now that I'd figured that out, I started using the white paint. I started using the white paint for clouds up in the sky, which it starts to look a little bit more obvious now that they're supposed to be clouds, at least compared to before, because, you know, before it's like it didn't even make a difference, but now that I've figured out that it was the paint all along, it's a little bit easier now to make the clouds. In a way, there are already kind of clouds in the sky because of how I kind of blended everything together, but, you know, what are you gonna do? So at this point, I think I'd actually waited for some of the white snow to dry, and I was actually starting to add some of the old paint right now, and I did that completely intentionally. I did it to sort of lighten some of the area, you know, the mountainous area, and to give it a sort of like, you know, nicer sheen, which I'm kind of glad I didn't throw away the old paint, because it really worked in my favor that I still had the old paint to give it that sort of, you know, nice bluish grayish, very slightly green sheen, at least, you know, in regards to the mountains. It did definitely differentiate the mountains from the forested areas a little bit more. Like, there was a little bit more of a difference this time, so that was definitely a positive, and I'm actually surprised that I even had the idea to do something like that at all, because usually, more often than not, I'm just kind of, you know, guessing with stuff like this. But that's usually all I ever do with painting. I like have a general idea, but I don't do any specific planning until I'm actually in the painting process. Well, and even then, I would say that I don't necessarily plan very well. So I think I added another layer of the old white paint as well, to give it, to lighten it even more. And again, I think it's starting to become just a slight bit more obvious now, especially the sort of color and brightness difference between the middle section of the mountains and the snow, and then the lower section of the green and the forests. Ouch. I don't remember if I put on a third layer. I might have just put on two, because I think I was relatively happy. Okay, I can already tell that I had to pause for a moment and change the lighting of the recording anyways, again. But where is my hand? I don't see my hand anywhere. That's weird. Did I accidentally forget to, Okay, either I was figuring out how to do stuff, or I accidentally forgot to take this part out of the final video that I ended up scrunching up together, because again, I had to cut some parts out. Here is basically the painting finished with slightly better lighting, so I could, you know, take a decent picture to show you the color differences and whatnot. But this is basically what I turned that picture that's been in the upper left corner the entire time. It's basically what I turned it into, and, you know, I was semi-happy with it. Like, I thought it was definitely kind of neat, but it wasn't entirely what I was, you know, intending to paint. But it was still pretty fun to do, and I'm still glad that I've gotten back into painting as of late. So thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this speed paint and the respective commentary. And as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.